What's up, camera nerds? Josh here with my first ever camera review, and you'd think my first review would be something like the new Canon C70, the Red Komodo, and yes, those reviews are coming, so be sure to hit subscribe for those. But the release of those cameras, and many others this year, does beg the question, is the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K still worth buying? And my answer would be a resounding yes. For one thing, you have the price. Sitting at $12.95, just the fact that you can shoot RAW with this thing is insane, even 2+ years after its release. Now, a lot of reviewers out there will say that you need to spend another $1,000 in accessories just to make this a usable camera. Well, yes and no. It just depends on what you're going to do with it. For me, I just bought a handful of batteries, a cheap SD card, and I was in business. But I'll talk about that more in a minute. The Pocket 4K shoots Blackmagic's B-RAW, which is beautiful. You have 13 stops of dynamic range, and bringing back those highlights when overexposed 2 or 3 stops is actually no problem at all. And speaking of exposure, you're going to be exposing based on either the histogram at the bottom left of the screen, zebras, and or false color. You do have a micro four thirds sensor, which I wasn't thrilled about coming from a full frame camera, but I've learned to adapt my shooting style so that I'm still getting kind of a similar look, at least a look that I want. Now, one of the nice things about having such a tiny sensor is that you can adapt almost any lens and it will cover that sensor. The first lens I put on this was a vintage Canon 50mm 1.8, and it looked great. In fact, I did an entire shoot in Yosemite National Park with just vintage lenses, and I was really happy with it. Now, because I shoot a lot of destinations and am often in a run and gun type of situation, I settled on a zoom lens as my go-to. And this is probably the most versatile lens you can buy for micro four thirds. It's the Olympus 12-100 f4IS Pro. That's a 24 to 200 millimeter, 35 millimeter equivalent focal range. That's a massive range. And because I don't often shoot in low light, maxing out at f4 doesn't really bother me. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check that lens out. Now, speed boosters are also an option with this camera. I don't always use them myself, but if you do want to go that route, I would recommend the Metabones 0.64 adapter, which is going to give you a 1.3 stop increase in lens aperture. And that link will also be in the description. When it comes to recording, you have both Blackmagic RAW and ProRes. Now, I picked this camera up before there was B-RAW support for Premiere Pro, which is my go-to NLE, so I would shoot a lot in ProRes. But since they added that support, I've switched to B-RAW exclusively, not only because of the flexibility it gives me, but because you can shoot at a 12:1 compression ratio, which still looks incredible, and massively saves on hard drive space. Which brings me to recording media, because by shooting B-RAW 12:1, I'm able to record 4K DCI at 60 frames a second to a $70 SanDisk Extreme Pro SD card. But if you want to push it to the max and record, say, Q0, you're going to need something more substantial, like a rather expensive CFast card, or buy yourself an SSD like the incredibly popular Samsung T5. If you're like me and you have a full-size SSD lying around, you can achieve the same results. You're just going to need to get a little bit creative when it comes to mounting. When it comes to frame rates, you have a lot to choose from. You can shoot up to 60 frames per second in 4K DCI, 75 frames per second in 4K 2.4:1, and 120 FPS in 2.6K. And the 120 RAW looks fantastic. The only downside when you step down in resolution from 4K DCI, you're actually cropping into the sensor, which is going to change your focal length on the already small sensor. And unless I need that 120 FPS for something very specific, I typically stay at 4K 60, especially when I'm shooting B-roll handheld. just to help smooth out any camera shake. And because this camera has a kind of mirrorless form factor, you are going to get that side-to-side shake, but throwing a cage with a top handle will definitely go a long way if that's your shooting style. For handheld shots where you can keep fairly steady and you don't need to make any sweeping movements, lens image stabilization does help a lot, but there is no internal stabilization on this camera. This is going to prompt a lot of people to want to throw this on a gimbal, but you may need an additional mounting plate, and that's simply because this thing is crazy wide. It's just a little bit awkward in terms of form factor. This camera does feature dual ISO, which essentially means you can get better dynamic range at higher ISOs. Shooting in B-RAW, colors also tend to stay true, meaning you don't see color shifts or saturation problems, even up into higher ISOs, which is pretty impressive for a camera at this price point. That said though, this is not a low light camera. If you're shooting in the upper range, even with a speed booster and a big aperture, you're going to get a lot of noise. So don't expect to shoot with available light in darker scenarios and get a clean image. When it comes to audio, this camera is really impressive. You have an 1/8 inch stereo mic input, a headphone jack, and a mini XLR input. The audio menu itself is incredibly easy to use. You can enable phantom power over XLR, you have mic and line options, and you can split channels. So for instance, I purchased a left-right splitter cable and was able to record 2 lavaliers as separate channels through the 1/8 inch jack. The menu overall itself is one of my favorite features of this camera. I mean, this is the easiest menu system I have ever used. Very user-friendly and intuitive. It is all touchscreen, but you do have programmable function buttons on the top if you want quick access to settings like zebras and false color. The buttons themselves are okay. They're a little bit squishy, but honestly, I almost always use the touchscreen anyway. And speaking of the touchscreen, the screen doesn't flip up or out. So depending on what you're doing with this camera, you're probably gonna want an external monitor so you can see what you're doing without having to contort yourself. As far as power goes, this thing uses Canon's old LPE6 battery, which gives you about 40 minutes of power. The camera's battery meter isn't super specific about how much battery life you have left, so it can die in the middle of a shoot without much warning. So once that meter starts going red, you'll probably want to switch out that battery as soon as possible. If you're shooting something critical like an interview and you need a longer lasting battery, you should check out Blackmagic's battery grip or a third-party battery option. And let me tell you, there are a lot of them. There are power adapters for USB-C, for DTAP, for 2-pin, the list goes on. You have a lot of options here. When it comes to editing, this camera comes with a DaVinci Resolve Studio license, which normally retails at $295. It's a great program to know, but as I said earlier, you can edit B-RAW in Premiere Pro. You just have to download the software update from Blackmagic. In Premiere Pro, you can find the Blackmagic color controls by selecting your clip, then go to the effects panel and go to master properties. Now, in my experience, this can be a little glitchy. There's no easy way to copy and paste these settings from clip to clip, and sometimes they're grayed out for no particular reason. I don't know if that's a problem on Blackmagic's end or Adobe's, but they definitely have some bugs to work out. So earlier I said you don't have to rig this out to make it usable, and that, for me, is true. I carry about 5 to 6 LPE6 batteries, a single zoom lens, and I record on a 256 gig SD card at 12:1 compression. Things like a flip out screen, a bigger battery option, a cage, all those things I've learned to live without in favor of a smaller footprint. That said, this camera is going to be most useful when it's rigged up or when it's used in a studio setting. You can rig it for run and gun, as many people have, but it certainly wouldn't be my first choice. I also wouldn't recommend it for vloggers simply because there's no eye or face detection autofocus. To focus, you either have to push the focus button, select a spot on the screen to focus on, or use a third-party app. And the autofocus itself is a little bit clunky. All of that said, if you want to shoot RAW that looks great under $2,000, this is definitely your camera. It does have its limitations, but if you want that look and flexibility in post, you're going to learn to work around those. Now, there are a lot of features I didn't cover here, especially with all the firmware updates that have come out since they launched the camera. There are just a lot of little feature add-ons, but also things like using this as a live studio camera with the A10 Mini, a feature that really deserves its own video. But those are my thoughts on the Pocket 4K. Despite its quirks, I still really enjoy shooting with it. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And if you found this useful, be sure to like and subscribe for future camera reviews. We'll see you next time.